thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak on this. I've been watching the series for a really long time, so it's a real honour to be here. Also, the slight disclaimer that everything I'll be talking about today is still a work in progress. I'm currently in the second year of my PhD, still got a long way to go, so any feedback, comments, suggestions, absolutely more than welcome. So, like Delia very kindly said, I will be looking today at intra and interword variation in conceptual engineering, and I'll now give a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll spend a tiny bit of time defining conceptual engineering, mainly because people here are usually already aware what it is, before splitting the talk into two separate parts. So I'll be looking at interword variation, or how different words behave differently when it comes to conceptual engineering, and then intra-word variation, namely variation within a single word across its different uses, and trying to introduce some empirical techniques to start documenting and investigating this variation that we can see. So first, a short note on conceptual engineering. The definition I've chosen to put here is one of Pollock of 2020. Conceptual engineering is a methodology that consists in some combination of evaluating concepts or word meanings, identifying ways to improve them, and applying these improvements and/or implementing these changes in an individual or community. There's a lot to unpick in that definition and way more that I could do in a single presentation. So I'm mainly going to be focusing on the underlined section there, evaluating concepts or word meanings. Different authors have suggested different target constructions for conceptual engineering. So things like concepts construed in various different ways, word meanings and words, commitments, functions, prototypes, propositions. But for my presentation and my work, my focus is on psychologically real linguistic meaning. So I'm looking at these linguistic meanings mainly at the moment embodied in this word target that is on this list here. And for this reason, for the rest of this presentation, I will be talking about conceptual engineering as if it aims to change or influence linguistic meaning. But I don't think that it's the only method of conceptual engineering out there. I think these other ones are also interesting aspects. They're all valid. As I heard the other day for the first time, a nice idiom called different horses for different courses. So the horse that I have chosen is word meaning and linguistically oriented communicative meaning. Just so we're all on the same page on what ameliorative projects are and what can be considered improvement, I've got three very brief examples here that people will in all likelihood already know. The first is truth, which Sharp has suggested engineering due to the fact that it is logically inconsistent and so should be replaced by either ascending truth and descending truth, or truth one and truth two. Haslanger has written a lot about race and has written about how we should have an alternative definition based on social positioning and oppression as opposed to biological features. And one of the other most frequently mentioned ones is that of planet, where the definition of the word planet was changed in order to exclude Pluto from its set. More specifically, they did it to change the definition to clearing the neighborhood around its orbit, but as a consequence, Pluto was excluded from this. As I said, I focus on word meaning, linguistic and communicated meaning, but in these projects here, we can see that there's a lot more at play here. So they're obviously aiming to change not only how we speak and communicate these ideas, but also how we think about them, how we use them to classify. So what I'm doing does not exhaust these projects in the slightest, but it does form part of all of these projects, since some of the defects or problems that they note in these concepts or words show themselves in our communication and in our conversation. So I think that's a good place to at least start or target when it comes to these projects. So under this definition and this narrower focus, there are two particular problems that I've been thinking about when it comes to conceptual engineering recently. The first is what I'm calling the interword variation problem, or in other words, are all words the same? Can we expect and anticipate the same outcomes for all kinds of words in conceptual engineering? Should we be engineering them with the same goals? Is there a singular process that we can employ that optimally conceptually engineers all kinds of words? As a sort of spoiler for the next section, my argument will be no, and that's what the first area of this talk will focus on. The other question that I'm asking myself is what I'm calling the intra-word variation problem, which links to what happens when we actually use words. So the variations in meaning we see in a single word across multiple different usages of that word and what it means for projects of conceptual engineering. So to illustrate this point a bit, I've got a couple of sentences here that all include the word woman. So according to the law, Nina is a woman. Don't be such a woman. Justice for all women. Don't be too harsh on her. She's just a woman. And the island was a woman of serenity and allure. While they all contain the word woman, they can't all be said to contain the same aspects of meaning of the word woman. For example, in the metaphor one, the island was a woman of serenity and allure seems to contain neither the biological features that Haslanger speaks about, nor the social ones that she's trying to implement. Justice for all women is in all likelihood more likely using these more socially orientated aspects of its meaning, whereas according to the law, Nina is a woman probably is using a more biological definition of it or zooming in on the more biological features. So what we can see is that each token of the same type is not identical. They will retain some relation to the type definition of woman, but this kind of variation does throw a considerable wrench into the word engineering. So that's what I'll be focusing on for the second half of this presentation. So let's turn first to the inter-word variation problem and ask ourselves, are all words the same? My basic intuition and my first intuition when it comes to this question is the word no. The overarching goal of conceptual engineering is improvement, but this leaves a lot unsaid. So, for example, what exactly are we trying to improve? Are we trying to achieve a better understanding? Are we trying to change things like social reality or the understanding of science? Are we trying to change words or are we trying to change the world? Are we simply rebranding what a word means? And I think that different words necessitate different answers to these questions. There isn't one consistent answer that's applicable across all of them. So to exemplify this, let's have a look at the words tiger and freedom. Tigers exist objectively in the real world. In more philosophical terms, they have a non-empty extension in the real world, and this extension, or their denotation, exists independently of what we think about them or know about them. We have no control over what tigers are. We can potentially learn more about them or think that change how people think about tigers, take them to be less scary, for example, but we can't change what tigers are in the world around us. So the goal of engineering a word such as tiger cannot be to change the world. And depending on your theory of word meaning, it may also be the case that you can't even change the word. If you don't think that these encyclopedic or connotational pieces of information are contained within word meaning, then there's really not much we can do with words like this. On the other hand, we have words like freedom, which does not objectively exist in the world around us. It's an abstract concept that gets its definition from human thought and action and can vary over time and in different societies. In a world with a word like this, changing what the word meaning is not only possible, but also inevitably worldly. What freedom is depends on our conceptualization of it, what we consider the meaning to be. And so, therefore, theoretically, we should have a larger degree of control over it. But also it means that there is no distinction between word and world in words like this. So therefore, what we can say so far is that something about the word itself influences what we as human agents can do with it. And I'm not the first one to mention anything like this. Sawyer has written extensively on it, Boucher, Thomason. They all use these kinds of facts to suggest that potentially we should be looking in more detail at individual kinds of words and treating them differently as a result for conceptual engineering. However, not all accounts do treat them differently. So, for example, Capellan's austerity framework, he's very insistent that his framework operates on intensions and extensions. It's not about words, it's about the world. It's about what these things are and not necessarily about the concepts that underlie them or the words that denote them. But most importantly, he says that all instances of conceptual engineering are about this. And sure, for some instances, that might indeed actually work. For example, freedom. If we change the intention or extension of that word, we do change its worldly conception. We change what it is. But this doesn't seem to work for all kinds of words. For example, fish, in Carnat's famous explication of fish to Pisces, it doesn't involve any changes in what fish are. It doesn't involve any kind of worldly changes. We can only discover new things about them or frame them in a different way. And the downfall of this approach is that we have to treat all words in this former way. It doesn't leave any space for the latter. So as Sawyer has written, ignoring such variations leads to a restrictive metasemantic framework that accommodates only a subset of the particular projects while generating implausible accounts of others. To avoid something like this, we can potentially swing another way to a much more individualistic focus of conceptual engineering. So function-based conceptual engineering. In these kinds of frameworks, the quote that I use a lot for this is, to engineer a concept well, we must attend to its function. So for example, Thomason's idea of functionalist CE is that we must first identify what functions concepts have and then what functions they should serve instead. But an approach like this is very individualistic. It focuses on each word or each concept individually, what its functions are, what its functions should be, and ignores these overlying commonalities that I've been talking about so far. I do think that this individualism is important for conceptual engineering, and we'll come back to that in the latter half of this talk. But I think there is something to having and capturing this regularity across different kinds of words. So a step in the right direction. Before I talk about the framework that I am putting forward, I need to introduce the framework that it's based on. So I am heavily influenced by the work of Sarah Sawyer and her article on concept pluralism, where she creates this beautiful, almost like I've shown here, decision tree of different kinds of ways that concepts can vary and what it would mean for conceptual engineering. One thing to note is that this framework is indeed designed to work on concepts as opposed to anything else, which I'll touch on again in the next slide, but just wanted to highlight that. Sarah Sawyer creates these three distinctions. So the first one is what she calls direction of determination, where you have world to mind or mind to world direction, where world to mind individuation depends on an objective property that a word refers to, whereas mind to world is where a word is determined by our individual or communal conceptions of it. So while world to mind words can be things like gold and tiger, mind to world will be things like game and juice. The next layer that she presents is called modal range. And while all mind to world concepts fall under the practice bound category that she names, because they are bound to our practices, our minds, on the world to mind side, we have world bound or world invariant concepts. World bound have the possibility of epistemic counterparts, whereas world invariant concepts do not. It's where an epistemic counterpart is something that exists in another possible world corresponding to something in our actual world. So something like a Putnam twin Earth style experiment. These world bound concepts are susceptible to this, whereas world invariant ones are not. And the final layer that she puts forward is temporal range, where all world to mind concepts are time invariant because they're not bound to our linguistic practices or our conceptions, and so don't change over time as our language changes, whereas time-bound and externally anchored ones do. So time-bound concepts are determined by contemporaneous communal conceptions, such as what a game is or what juice is, varies per generation, per community, per time. Or they can be externally anchored, so where they're anchored by a set of institutionalized practices, such as criminal, bishop, or marriage. I've gone through this rather quickly, but a lot of the aspects that I'm introducing here will also come back up again in the framework that I'm presenting, so don't worry if something's a bit vague, hopefully it'll clear up a bit later on. She uses this framework for conceptual engineering in order to identify a proper subset of concepts for special ameliorative attention. So, for example, she suggests that externally anchored concepts like criminal or bishop need to be socially engineered in order to be changed. We need these institutionalized practices to change. But for something like a world to mind concept, we can't engineer them in ways the same way that we would engineer these externally anchored ones. Changing the social practices that we have and the institutions that we report to will not change what tigers are or what gold is. So this kind of captures that systematicity that I was speaking about, that we have this intuition that different words can behave differently and change in different ways. However, as I was saying, Sarah Sawyer's account applies to concepts, which she takes to be outward-facing entities that fix reference. For me, like I said right at the beginning, I work in a framework where I'm talking about linguistically communicated meaning. And at this point in time, I'm specifically talking about word meaning. And even in Sarah's account, she takes the stance that word meanings and concepts are not the same things. So she subscribes to the conception distinction, where concepts are, like I said, outward-facing entities, whereas conceptions are inward-facing entities and concern individual beliefs and mental states. And she says the meaning of terms are determined by a combination of patterns of actual use across its linguistic community, together with relations of difference, typically implicit, between its members. So we can see here that Sarah Sawyer, much like me, takes word meaning to be different from concept. Much more is included in this notion of word meaning, which means a framework that targets concepts or creates this structured hierarchy of concepts will not be the same as a framework that targets a hierarchy of word meanings. To say a little bit more on that, I've already sort of implicated that I think that word meanings are more than concepts. I'll just briefly say what I think that means. So I take word meanings to consist of reference and extra pragmatic information. So reference will link the word to the external entity that it refers to, and then this is further inflated with some pragmatic or contextual information, such as the typical function, the typical properties, and these ideas will be filtered through our own perceptions and socializations. And these words can then be later further inflated with extra pragmatic information in context. So the way that I'm thinking about it currently is like this balloon that the person is holding in this stock image. The balloon already contains some air. It's partially inflated. And then based on the context, we can either add or take away air in order to inflate it to the level that we need for that precise moment. For now, this is all I'll say about this, mainly because this notion of word meaning is something I'm currently still ironing out the details in. But for now, all that's important is that words meaning consists of more than reference and contains a lot of extra linguistic and contextual information that an account where word meaning is the same as concept would not have. If we try and make a taxonomy of word meaning so construed, we see that a lot of different aspects can be introduced that are not present in Sarah Sawyer's original taxonomy, because hers is aimed at this conceptual level, whereas mine is aimed at this word meaning level. So without further ado, this is the framework that I am putting forward for inter-word variation. On the very top level, we have world-oriented and mind-oriented words, which basically correspond to the same categories that Sawyer uses, except I have renamed them simply because I've discovered the terminology is actually quite confusing in the linguistic sphere of influence, because they correspond to keywords that are often used in speech act theory that would basically implicate the opposite direction of what they would in Sawyer's framework. So hence made it slightly clearer to a wider audience, basically. My second level is differentiating abstract and concrete words. And then there is a third level only on the mind-orientated side, where I'm talking about this functional aspect of things. I want to put a small disclaimer in here that these kind of features that I'm specifying here, I do not take to be exhaustive. I'm not saying that they define the whole lexicon. I'm simply saying that they group and categorize words in a way that we can observe similarities and highlight the insufficiency of a homogeneous treatment of all lexical items in conceptual engineering. This isn't a theory of word meaning. I'm not saying these are componential parts of what a word meaning is. It's a theory of conceptual engineering over anything else. So having established that, let's have a look at these different levels in a little bit more detail. The first one is the lexical orientation. So there's not that much to say here, since it's basically the same as Sawyer put forward. So it deals with the referential component of word meaning. We see here that I define world-orientated as words whose meaning is partially determined by reference to an independent external entity in the world, regardless of our beliefs. I say partially here because, like I said, my notion of word meaning means that words cannot be exhausted by this external component, but in world-oriented ones, they are at least partially determined by them. As a consequence of this, tigers are tigers no matter what we think about them. Therefore, sort of these reference determining facts are determined by worldly facts, and we can't change these. We can't change what tigers, trees, water, gold, no matter how hard we try. We cannot change this referential component. We can only change this pragmatic overlay component of the word meaning. These kinds of words are therefore not amenable to Capellan's worldly approach that we spoke about earlier. They can only be changed at this level of emotions, connotations, experiential components that I also take to be part of word meaning. Therefore, for world-orientated words, ironically, they're not actually anything to do with the world when we go to engineer them. On the other side, we have mind-oriented words, which are influenced and shaped by our thoughts and beliefs, and their referent exists because of our usage and beliefs. These words don't refer to any objective properties or entities. They are in existence, manifested, maintained, changed by human thought and usage. So theoretically, we should have some control over these words. But as a result of this characterization, you can't separate the mind and the world, or the word and the world in these kinds of cases. Changing the meaning of the words themselves means that there will be a change in the world. Once again, there's no choice between the two. It has to be both. So therefore, I think there's no point fighting about whether we should have a word or world-based notion of conceptual engineering. I think this is governed by the kind of word you're engineering. And I have set this kind of lexical orientation thing at the very top of my hierarchy because it sets some very important parameters for what we can expect for the outcome of conceptual engineering. What are we actually trying to change? That's the highest sort of meta level that we can get to. The second level that I'm looking at is this abstract concrete divide. So in the case of concrete words, I've got them the wrong way around here on the slide, I've just noticed. But we see that concrete words have, hang on a second, where is it? There we go. Concreteness is the degree to which a concept denoted by a word refers to a perceptible entity. It can be seen, touched, tasted, smelled, or heard, whereas abstractness is the exact opposite. And while this might also seem to be a property of the referent and therefore to do with concepts as opposed to word meanings, I think it's also about how we as humans interact with and store the information, both linguistic and extra-linguistic, to do with these features. So the most important part of this, I think, is the degree of context dependence that these words show. So I've been drawn on something that was created by Schwanenflügel et al., and they call it contextual availability, which is the ease with which people contextualize words. So while concrete words are usually linked to specific contexts, situations, domains, abstract words tend to embody broader ideas, which can vary in their application of their usage. Abstract words are more open, therefore, to interpretation and influenced by these contextual factors, individual perspectives, and linguistic conventions. And as a result, we therefore have a greater latitude in modifying and shaping the meanings of abstract words to suit specific purposes or contexts. Concrete ones, on the other hand, are limited simply because they are associated with specific sensory characterizations. To engineer a concrete word means that we have to navigate these concrete features. We have to decide which to capture and which to not capture. So to summarize this distinction, it's important because it goes around defining how we go about changing these words. Do we need to stay as close to perceptual input as possible? Can we leverage contextual flexibility to allow for more dramatic changes? Concreteness tends to favor the former and abstractness tends to favor the latter. Before I move on to the last one, I want to put in some fine print here. The third layer, as you saw when I characterized the framework, is only on one side. It's only on the mind-oriented side. But why? Why is this asymmetry justified? I think there's a good reason that this functionalist third layer is only on the mind-oriented side, and I'm appealing to emergentism in order to motivate this. So the words in the mind-to-world category don't refer to an objective reality, but to the grey area between our micro-level reality and what emerges when we arrange it into our own human stories, shaped by societies and cultures, which is what Kasia wrote in 2023. These words have meanings that relate to emergent realities that emerge alongside human consciousness. The idea is that these functional categories of these mind-oriented worlds emerge from dynamic interactions and organizations of cognitive processes. On the other hand, world-oriented words don't have these functional subcategories because they are directly tied to observable aspects of the external world rather than emerging from our complex cognitive processes. And as a result, only mind-oriented words have these purposes and functions that the world-oriented words simply do not have. So let's talk about function, the very last layer. Abstract and concrete words can have different functions. So let's start with the abstract ones. The three that I think are of most importance to conceptual engineering are value-bound, practice-bound, and theory-bound functions. So value-bound functions are words that represent ideas, beliefs, or principles that are imbued with subjective value or significance. So these are words that relate to moral, ethical, aesthetic, emotional domains, characterized by their evaluative or affective nature. So words such as justice, beauty, happiness, love. Practice-bound words, on the other hand, are closely tied to practical activities, behaviors, or rituals, guided by social norms, cultural practices, or personal habits. So these are words such as family, gender, woman. Finally, theory-bound words have theoretical or intellectual significance. They represent ideas, principles, and constructs foundational to academic disciplines, scientific theories, or philosophical frameworks. And these include words such as theory, concept, abstraction, paradigm, things like that. On the other hand, we have, for the concrete words, social function and material function, where social functions are their functioning, defining, and creating social reality, whereas material function is their usage as a tool or artifact created to achieve specific human goals, such as fork or chair. This sounds like a lot, but I think it's important for conceptual engineering on sort of the lowest level, hence why it's at the bottom of the diagram that I've drawn. It's important at the practical level for how we analyze, implement, and ameliorate these kinds of words. So, for example, on the analysis front, for value-bound words, we would potentially want to elicit and understand subjective meanings that are present in individuals or cultural groups. For practice-bound concepts, analysis will probably best progress through observational studies, ethnographic research. And for theory-bound words, you would want to try and explore the theoretical foundations, constructs, and principles that underlie these words. The methodology could also differ when you're designing concepts or designing new word meanings. You have to take different things into account. For example, its importance to the theory as a whole, the importance to the education system, things like that. The methodology, therefore, will also differ. Value-bound ameliorations possibly might be best ameliorated through things like educational systems, teaching people at a young age what our concept of beauty or justice is. Practice-bound ameliorations likely would be better implemented through making use of social currency, high-status individuals, and so forth, whereas theory-bound ameliorations are probably better distributed through scientific writings, groups, journals, things like that. So to return to the framework, this is just, once again, to show you, now that you have a bit more of an idea of what I'm talking about. And the one thing that's left to do and left to discuss in this section is why this is actually useful, what this gains us. So on one hand, while I acknowledge that each word is unique, and the second half of this talk will focus on that, categories like this will guide us towards some handy patterns, which are more useful than just saying each word is unique, especially in cases where conceptual engineering is done by people who aren't familiar with linguistic or philosophical theory. Another benefit that I think I see in this kind of approach is something I'm calling cross-category movement, which is where either via conscious effort to engineer or potentially just through natural processes, words can move across the categories that I've introduced. And as a result, it gives us insight into the consequences of our ameliorative projects and how to go about considering and theorizing about the new word as opposed to the old one. So, for example, let's take the example here on the left of phlogiston. It was originally thought to be world-orientated. We thought it objectively existed out in the world. Scientists sought it, used it to explain lots of scientific theories. However, we then found out that it didn't actually exist. It can't be an objective world-oriented property if it's something that we created as a best explanation for something around us. So therefore, over time, due to, you could call it conceptual engineering or just natural change, it moved from this concrete world-orientated world to a abstract, mind-oriented, theory-bound word. And finally, another benefit that I see here is that it makes us start in thinking a bit more coherently about the notion of polysemy in conceptual engineering. So I believe the account that I've put forward here means that we can put different polysemes in different categories. So the example I have here is school. We see how school is an abstract entity, schooling, our education more generally, but it's also the building down the street. The very physical bricks and mortar building. While these two are very clearly related, and engineering one should definitely consider engineering of the other, the fact that they belong in different categories in such a framework means that we should consider and theorize about them differently. We can't ignore these variations that different polysemes have at risk of neglecting one of the many functions that these words may have. So this will also apply for things like woman, or trying to think of another word with that's polysemous, but my mind's gone completely blank. But the point here is that by concretely putting them into different categories, we're forced to consider the practicalities that vary among these different kinds of words. So finally, let's move on to the second half of this presentation. So far, I've been talking about words in isolation, but what happens when we actually use words in context? We've been looking at word types, decontextualized words as we would see them in the dictionary. So that's characterized by this diagram on the left here. We can see that potentially cat, dog, and lion are very close to each other, similar in terms of the categories they're in, the features that they might represent, whereas something like king or queen are on the other side of the box. They're not as similar, they would be in a different category. However, when we talk about intra-group variation, this is not the kind of variation that we're interested in. Instead, we're interested in this box on the right, where each dot represents different usages of the same word. So say, for example, these dots here align with the sentences I've put just next to them. I saw a lion in the zoo, I saw a lion in the piazza, my son left his lion on the floor, he roared like a lion, and the lion shrugged nonchalantly. All of these, again, like I've said at the very beginning, have slightly different usages of the word lion. Some refer to stone lions, some cuddly toy lions, a metaphorical roaring property, or attributing some kind of human properties to a lion. Each dot represents a different usage of the same word, and some usages are more similar to each other than others. Why does this matter? It matters because, returning to the aim of my project more generally, I'm looking at psychological plausibility. Words exist independently of our use, but in everyday usage, we don't necessarily process this dictionary style type meaning. We tend to go straight to this token meaning. A lot of psycholinguistic research has shown that we don't access the literal version first before moving on to the pragmatically enriched version of the word. We don't necessarily process that my son left a literal animal lion on the floor before we consider the option that it's a cuddly toy lion. And this has been shown in a lot of research by people, for example, like Gibbs, which means that for projects of conceptual engineering looking to target psychologically real, pragmatically rich, contextualist meaning in real discourses, these kinds of token meanings really do matter. This is a similar kind of approach to that of Pinder's speaker meaning approach, in which he says conceptual engineering consists of a speaker making it explicit that they will speak and mean M by X in specific local contexts. And I think Pinder is completely correct in this kind of characterizations. And I agree with him that he is pushing forward this focus on speaker meanings in actual discourses. But where I disagree with him is that I don't think it should exhaust conceptual engineering, because I believe that we should also place our focus on the standing semantic meanings I was talking about in the first section. But for now, for this section, what I'm talking about here, the sentiment rings true. A little just theoretical note, I've used the word contextualism in a lot of different ways now, so I just want to clarify for people who might not necessarily have knowledge into the linguistic or philosophical theory consisting this. I've said that I was looking for a contextualist notion of word meaning. But now I'm also saying that what I'm looking at with different words being used differently is also contextualist. That's because I want to distinguish between lexical contextualism and propositional contextualism. So lexical contextualism consists of pragmatic information entering into word meaning. So these kinds of experiential, distributional, perceptual characteristics entering into the standing meaning of words. Whereas propositional contextualism allows context or pragmatics to enter into propositional or truth conditional meaning. So this focuses on the level of utterances or propositions as opposed to single words. These aren't two mutually exclusive categories. People tend to use one or the other or both. I think we arguably will need both levels, as I've kind of already suggested. The lexical level, because I think full competence with lexical items or knowing a word's meaning relies on more than this extension determining information. And because we also need this propositional notion where we need to consider the actual truth conditional content our whole utterances can be said to communicate. For the remainder of this talk now, I'm going to focus on the propositional side of things. There are many different theories about this. I'm not going to use a specific one simply because it doesn't add anything to the point that I'm trying to make, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about some different approaches to this. Suffice it to say for now is what a standing meaning of a word does not necessarily equate to the meaning it contributes to truth conditional meaning, which is why we have to look at these variations in word meaning for conceptual engineering if we're targeting this contextually rich propositional notion. So I will now move on to the empirical work that I've been doing in this sphere. So the aim of this section is to present this ongoing empirical work, and it starts with what Haslanger would call the operative, manifest, and target concepts. So the manifest concept is the concept I take myself to be applying or attempting to apply. The operative concept is the concept that best captures the distinction as I draw it in practice. And the target concept is the concept I should ideally be employing. If we're looking at meanings in use in conversation, in discourse, the operative concept and its relation with the manifest concept is currently what interests me the most. How do we actually use words and meanings in their current state? Before doing any kind of conceptual engineering, we have to know what we're dealing with. You wouldn't be driving into an unknown territory without a map to tell you where we're going. Only when we know where we can pinpoint which contexts are the problematic ones, where the word's causing issues, where is it demonstrating its defects, what different uses are there and how are they linked? How would they change if we were to change the manifest concept into the target concept? And also, quite importantly, how does how people think they use a concept line up with how they actually use it? So I therefore aim to start mapping, looking at, quantifying this operative meaning with a viewpoint to extending it into almost a roadmap for how to conceptually engineer that particular work, or that particular word even. The answer to these kind of questions lies in real examples of discourse from real people. So one thing that I have chosen to do is to do some corpus work, mainly on spoken language, simply because that's the primary medium of communication, but I think is currently not adequately represented in conceptual engineering research. So therefore, I have chosen to look at the BNC14, or the British National Corpus from 2014, as the data source of trying to map out this operative meaning. And I have to say a big thank you to Ryan Daniels, who is a machine learning engineer of the Accelerate program, who's been helping me a lot with these kinds of things, and I believe is here today as well, so might be able to help in answering any difficult questions about this kind of stuff. So what exactly am I doing with this data? How am I utilizing this to find intra-word variation, the operative uses of words? The approach that I'm taking to try and computationally create a good picture of intra-word variation is word embeddings, and more specifically, contextualized word embeddings, or BERT, which stands for bidirectional encoded representations from transformers. So going right back to the graphs I showed you at the start of this section, this kind of algorithm does not create one point for different kinds of words. We don't have cat and dog over here and queen and king over here, but instead it creates one point per token of the specific word you're interested in the entirety of the corpus. And it considers the words around it and the context surrounding the target word. And this goes beyond simple presence or absence of other words. So, for example, these kinds of algorithms can tell you that theory commonly coincides with the words quantum, string, and conspiracy. But it can also tell you that quantum theory and string theory are more closely related in their usage of the word theory than the word or the phrase conspiracy theory. It sees all the words in the context window at once and strives to understand how each of these words impact and interact with each other, which is why it's such a good choice for trying to create this roadmap of the operative concepts in conceptual engineering. We used a context window of 30 words either way, which is equal to a couple of conversational turns. We chose this because other work, such as that of Cavoli et al. 2023, used a context window of 50 words either side, but this was on written data. So spoken data tends to switch conversational turns more quickly. We then projected all these embeddings onto a graph, very similar to what I showed you at the beginning, to show you that the points that are close together are more similar in their usage than points that are far away from each other, and use some clustering algorithms to sort of create computer-generated groups of usage. Rather than just using visual inspection to try and say this is more similar to that, we created some metrics to try and explain this. So one of them is maximum explained variance, which very fancily put is the proportion of variance that can be explained by first principle component, or an upper bound on how well a static embedding could replace a word's contextualized embedding. Basically, what this means is how much variation can still be captured if we posit a single point on this graph as opposed to the many points. Can all these different usages be condensed into a single meaning or a single point? How well can this happen? We also then use self-similarity, which is the average similarity between all the representations across all the contexts, which means a low self-similarity would mean all of the points and all the usages are very different, very dispersed from each other. And then finally, we use intra and inter-cluster similarity, which looks at, first of all, intra looks at how tight-knit the clusters are there nice coherent clusters? And inter-cluster looks at how well separated the clusters are from each other. So for example, with a highly homophonous word like bank and bank, as in riverbank and financial institution, we would expect two very tight-knit, very far away from each other's clusters because they're not part of the same lexical item. They are completely different meanings and will be used in completely different contexts. So that's all very vague, very ambiguous. So let's have a look at some actual instances of this. Let's first look at the word duty. This graph here demonstrates all 107 uses of the word duty in the spoken component of the British national corpus. And you can see they're very distributed. There's no real coherence in the usage of the word. There are technically, according to the clustering algorithm, 8 clusters here, which due to the coloring they've chosen are a bit hard to spot. So I've made it easier here by putting some circles on so you can see. So yeah, 8 clusters. Are they particularly coherent? No, I don't think they are. The maximum explained variance seems to be middle of the pack compared to all the other words that I looked at, meaning, well, it seems to be very low for all of the words I looked at. Replacing all of these 107 instances with a single point in space loses so much variation that this number is very low. It has the lowest self-similarity of any of the words that I've looked at, which is not surprising if you look at the actual distribution here. There is no order, there is no coherence whatsoever. There is no self-similarity within this word. And finally, it also has the highest inter-cluster similarity, which means the clusters are not well defined. They all overlap, they're very close to each other. There is no real separation. The intra-cluster similarity is also very high, but I think this is mainly because there are so many clusters, and also because there aren't that many points in each cluster. The chance of them being very similar to each other are just high by virtue of how many there are. This stays very numerical, and I think there's only so far that we can go with just numerical data. So a qualitative analysis is also required. Having looked at all 107 instances of the word duty, which was a fun afternoon, it's very interesting to see how this clusters, what all the clusters equate to. So, for example, the bottom left part of these clusters look at a legal definition. It talks about solicitor duty, stamp duty, tax duty. The area above it, we seem to see equates to duty to do a promised task. You are on lunch duty this evening. You are on break duty. The very top area refers to the very set phrase being on and off duty. The area below it, the middle, refers to duty-free shopping specifically. There are a lot more instances of references to duty-free shopping than I would expect. The area on the right refers to the video game Call of Duty, and also duty to use responsibly certain kinds of weapons. And the bottom area mainly refers to duty of over children and things like that. We can see that engineering a single meaning or point on this grid is probably not going to be a successful way of engineering this word. It has a very low maximum explained variance. A single point is highly unrepresentative of the whole cohort of uses. We also have a lot of fossilized expressions here, call of duty, being on and off duty. Would we need to engineer these as well if we're trying to engineer the word duty? Would these kinds of usages leach back into our new engineered usage of the word duty? We could potentially see these as just separate things that we don't need to consider. For example, the bank example that I gave later. But the extent to which all of these are very intertwined, interdependent, no clear separation suggests we can't simply disregard some of them. This is the map of usage of how we use the word duty. And the conclusion that we can draw from this one is our words do a lot more for us than convey a single static meaning. Engineering single meaning won't touch the majority of these uses, and these uses will continue to influence and build the mental representation of this lexical meaning. The second example I want to show you is the word wife. And we can immediately see that there's a lot of less variation here. We have two very distinct clusters. There are 625 uses here. We have, again, a low maximum explained variance, but all of them seem to have that. A high self-similarity, mainly because the clusters themselves are actually a lot more tight-knit than they were in the instance of duty. We see very low intra-group similarity, but that's because the clusters themselves are very big. A point at the top of one cluster is very likely to be quite far away from a point in the bottom of the cluster. So the clusters themselves are potentially slightly less coherent. But inter-similarity is low, which means they are two very reasonably well-defined clusters, which sounds great. Maybe one of these clusters is problematic usages and the other cluster isn't. It's not that simple. I tried really hard to do a good qualitative analysis here, but as of right now, how far I've managed to get with it, I haven't found a clear thing of what the algorithm is clustering these off of. My best guess so far is that the yellow clusters refer to a very negative usage of the word wife, a lot of slurs, a lot of personal experiences, very conversational tones, whereas the purple ones are much more positive uses of the word. We can potentially say that, okay, maybe this works better for conceptual engineering then. If this is separated only by sentiment, as opposed to anything else, I couldn't necessarily find any fossilized expressions, set constructions. Great, maybe this would work better. It still doesn't really tell us which uses are problematic. For example, the negative ones are in all likelihood more likely to be problematic, but that doesn't rule out the fact that the positive cluster will also contain some problematic usages. So very positive uses of wife in context where you're talking about very set or outdated gender roles or expectations concerning marriage. Talking about these in a positive light would put it in a positive cluster, which highlights why qualitative analysis is very important on top of anything else. I have one more, but I'm going to skip over this one so we can go to that in the Q&A if anybody's interested, looking at the word child. But I'll skip to the end of this part now and just tell you where I'm going to go with this in the future, hopefully. So it's all still a work in progress. And one thing I would very much like to have a look at is the relationship between the categories I've posited in the first half of the talk and this kind of distribution that I've posited in the second. For example, do words that are mind-oriented versus world-orientated show very different patterns when it comes to their usage? And does this tell us anything about how we can conceptually engineer them? I'd also like to extend this into a slightly more normative side of things. So for now, I've been looking at describing the operative concept as a sort of roadmap going into conceptual engineering. But I think that the different patterns that we can see in these word embeddings will have consequences for how easily or how we should or can engineer these kinds of concepts. So if we compare duty and wife, does the shape that we see there give us more positive or negative views on how we can engineer those concepts, basically? That's something I still want to think a little bit more about. I also want to try it with a large number of words. At the minute, I've only run this on 37 words. And I also want to try fine-tuning the model on my actual data to see if that changes anything and potentially try some other different models as well. And mainly the thing I'm going to have to do a lot of is qualitative analysis to try and find these patterns in this distribution and this usage. Like with wife, I haven't quite got there yet in terms of what the distinction there is. Conclusions from this part. I think the main conclusion that we can take away from this, regardless of the work that still needs to be done on it, is that considering word meaning to be a fixed static entity is detrimental to conceptual engineering efforts, and we need to start considering word meaning as a flexible, cooperative, and dynamic entity by looking at larger units than the word level. What we can do with this kind of information that I've been talking about, these word embeddings, is help grasp the operative concept, the operative meaning, pinpoint problematic usages, potentially use it to try and locate words that might be harder or easier to change. But like I said, this is still an idea. And more importantly, it shows us that we need to look at larger units of meaning to show how we actually use the words that we're meaning to change. To go back right to the beginning and the missing puzzle pieces I was talking about, are all words the same? No. We've considered that they have different features, properties, and functions that mean we should consider different groups differently in terms of the processes and outcomes we can expect for conceptual engineering. But the second half has also shown us this idiosyncratic nature, that these different words show these very different patterns when we actually start using them. And we need a balance between these two different accounts if we're going to have the greatest chance of success for conceptual engineering. The second question I asked was what happens when we use words? And the answer there is they vary even more than we could even think. And the next thing we need to start thinking about in relation to this is which usages that we've now identified do we want to target? Which are problematic? Which usages will shift as a result of our changes? And are there any specific fossilized constructions that we might need to take into account when we're engineering the word that we're looking to change? I've already offered some general conclusions and thoughts, so I'll keep this short and sweet. Basically, what I want to say is if we want to influence psychologically real linguistic meaning, we have to consider both intra and inter word variation. Thank you very much.